What's up, everybody? I am back. This is another vlog. I have been away for a couple of days, and the simple truth of the matter is I didn't have anything I felt was worth vlogging about. Now, I've said in the past that these vlogs are more for me. There's actually an interesting lesson here, because every time I step away from doing a vlog, getting back into being behind or in front of the camera and presenting this is a lot harder than I remember it when I was doing stuff on a regular basis or producing content on a regular basis. So I missed a week. I didn't have anything I felt was especially important to say. I didn't have any content in the list of stuff to work on where I was, hey, here's a good thing I can put up. So I just, instead of coming out and fumbling and rambling for half an hour or whatever, I just, I passed on doing the vlog. And then the next week, I sunk into what I call the period of artist's doubt. I didn't have a real good idea of what to talk about or what to cover, and I wasn't super in practice again with being in front of the lights and the camera and presenting, and so, I missed that week, and then was coming up to miss this week, and I said, I can't do 3 weeks in a row. That's not a really good idea. And plus, there are some things I want to talk about. They just maybe aren't as super important or world-ending or whatever as what I may have felt was necessary to talk about in general. One of those things is, was it 2 weeks ago now, I think it was, Adobe released Lightroom Classic 9.2, and with it they've completely revamped the camera defaults mechanism and how that works, and with that they've completely revamped the way you create camera defaults that are ISO variable or ISO specific. Or that change with the camera's ISO setting. And this is some feature that I really use, and I wanted to do a more in-depth video about it, and, well, quite honestly, the simple reality is I don't fully understand the new system enough yet to where I'm comfortable explaining to everybody in general how to write the files. Adobe has made some, in my opinion, improvements to the system in that you don't have to, it now uses an XMP file with an ISO specific section where you can specify, you don't have to specify every possible ISO, you can specify a handful of ISOs or many ISOs or whatever, and it's your choice, and the camera, or the camera, Lightroom and Camera Raw will interpolate the values between those ISOs. So if you say have your sharpening set to, and I'm just making some numbers up here, but you have your sharpening set to 10 at ISO 100 and 20 at ISO, or let's say noise reduction, because that wouldn't have made any sense anyway. You have your noise reduction set to 10 at ISO 100 and 20 at ISO 400. Then at ISO 200, it'll interpolate to a value of 15 or whatever you want to call that. So this is great. Actually, this is really big for a couple of reasons. First of all, Nikon users that use auto ISO, Nikon's auto ISO system in many of their cameras uses all kinds of crazy ISOs. I think what they're actually doing internally is they have control over the sensor or the ISO, the amplification gain at maybe an 1/8 stop level or something like that. And so when shooting auto ISO on a Nikon camera, instead of it using, say, 400, 500, 640, 800, that progression, I have seen it come up with like 560 or something to that effect in the ISO, the camera's automatic ISO modes. It'll just kind of pick intermediate values. The problem with the previous version of Lightroom and Camera Raw's auto ISO mechanism was that you had to have an image with that value. Now, this wasn't a problem, or hasn't been a problem for me as a Canon user, because Canon's auto ISO uses the same ISOs that you can manually select. And so, you know, I was able to just, with my Canon gear, I was able to do, just set up all the ISOs as defaults and then go from there. But like the guys I know who shoot Nikon, photographers I know that shoot Nikon, they could set up defaults for the ISOs that they could manually specify, but then the auto ISOs were like, it was just the Lightroom defaults, and that didn't work. So with the new Lightroom Classic / Camera Raw camera defaults, it'll interpolate to those for those ISOs. So if they set a setting, you know, set up their sharpening at say 400, and they set up their sharpening at say 1600, and the camera decides it wants to use 850 or 1100 or something like that, it'll figure out what the settings should be as they are between those two defined steps. This also makes it really easy for me as a Canon user, or just as a photographer in general, as the modern cameras, I mean, like a 5D Mark IV that I'm shooting these videos on, that's my staple camera, has an ISO range of 50 to 102,000. And that works out to be like 11-ish stops. So with third stop increments, or 10-ish stops or something like that. With third stop ISO increments, I think it works out to be like 28 frames that you have to take images at to do your ISOs, to do your defaults. And I am a huge proponent of, I found this is the absolute best technique that I've been able to come up with or use for sort of dialing in a new camera. I'm a very big proponent of shooting a test chart with a Graytec or an X-Rite color check card and a resolution test chart at every ISO, and then looking at that and making your adjustments based on that kind of controlled test conditions. You know, you shoot it with like a flash or continuous lights. You shoot it at a fixed aperture, at, you know, varying the ISO and the shutter speed, and only changing the aperture when you absolutely have to, so that you're looking at a directly relatable set of images that you can correlate what's happening with noise and sharpening and etc. And I like a test chart. I have a test chart. I'll put a link to the test chart I use on my website or in the description below. I like a test chart instead of trying to do something in the real world, because in the real world things change, lighting conditions change, you have camera movement, you're not locked off on a tripod, a cloud can move in front of the sun, change the lighting conditions, so you could go from a harsh light to a softer light and back to a harsh light, and it's not as clear-cut as I've found a clear-cut way to sort of dial in what your camera's going to do. And so, of course, the problem with this and the classic way of doing things in Lightroom was that I had to go through all of these images and make adjustments and sort of tune them on a image per image basis. And the problem with that is basically just overload. When you've got 28 or 30 images that you're going through and looking at a very fine sort of technical level, you're looking for detail, you're looking at the behavior of specific details. So, and for me, it's sharpening, so the sharpen amount, the radius, the detail, the luminance noise reduction, contrast, luminance noise contrast, and luminance noise reduction detail, and then chroma noise reduction, and the color smoothness and detail, or whatever they call it. So it's 9 settings. They're all somewhat interrelated. I have to look at all of them, and I have to be very methodical about what I'm looking at and how I'm doing it. And what I've always found is I tend to do really focus on the settings that I use, and then sort of as I get towards the higher ISOs, which I don't use as frequently, I tend to copy and paste the settings and then just set a default. Same thing goes with a lot of the third stop ISOs that I don't always use all that much. I'll just, like, I would copy the ISO 100 settings to 125 and 160 and 200, and maybe tweak 200 and then copy 200 to 250, 320, and then tweak 400. So with this new system in Lightroom 9.2 or Lightroom Classic 9.2, you don't have to do that anymore. You pick the ISO that's, you set ISO, you pick a handful of ISOs that you're going to tune, you tune them, and then everything else will sort of fall in place based on the interpolation that the software does. It's a linear interpolation that the Lightroom or Camera Raw does between the settings that you set. Where this gets complicated is actually in how and when the interpolation takes effect, how Lightroom and Camera Raw handle if you have a setting that's missing. So like if you set, we'll just say setting A, if I set setting A at ISO 100, I set setting B at ISO 200, and then at ISO 400 I set setting A again, whether Lightroom interpolates from between A and B, or interpolates between, or takes, whether Lightroom interpolates the ISO 200 value between A and B, or if it uses a default value because you didn't set the setting, but it's complicated, and I've sat down to try and understand it and make some notes on it, and it doesn't seem like the behaviors, I haven't figured out the exact details of the behavior. Unfortunately, Adobe's documentation on all of this is kind of crap, if not basically non-existent at the moment, and there isn't a lot of good tutorial other stuff that I've seen out there that really kind of explains what to expect and how the behavior works. And then, of course, the biggest sort of unfortunate part of the whole thing is it's now become a coding problem. You have to write these XMP files manually. You have to open them up in a text editor, add the sections that you want. Adobe's given some examples, but it's a little bit more tricky than just setting some settings in Lightroom and hitting Save as Default. And unfortunately, I think that's going to pose a little bit of a challenge in terms of adoption. I mean, not that I'm not entirely sure that the ISO-specific behaviors was all that widely adopted before, but to present this, I need to be able to sort of concisely figure out how to concisely demonstrate how to do this and explain it. And that's really hard to do when I don't fully understand it yet. I've gotten it working for the cameras I use, but I don't fully understand the exact interactions in certain places, and they're kind of important, and it's not like I don't want to just go off and talk about it half-baked. So that's one thing I'm working on. That's one thing that I'm trying to get sort of put together and done, because it's big change in the way it was, and it's a really powerful feature. ISO-specific camera defaults in Lightroom has always been a really powerful feature for setting defaults for sharpening and noise reduction, and it's something that I think is really useful to get out there with a good, clear, consistent, complete explanation. So that's the one thing that I'm working on. The other thing I wanted to talk about in this video is, in fact, pictures have shown up of the Canon EOS R5. So this is the mirrorless, professional level mirrorless camera that Canon has announced they're developing. Of course, at this point, it's developed. Let's just be honest. The announcement that they're developing the camera is a nice way for them to say, it's coming, but without having to put a lot of concrete details on when and what the features are. Although, to be honest with you, I think they probably have the development to a point where they could just do that. But they didn't want to do that, and anyway, so pictures have shown up on Canon. These are pictures coming from through Canon Rumors, is where I saw them, but they were originally posted on DC Watch, which is actually dc.watch.impress.co.jp. It's a Japanese site. I'm pretty sure it's basically Digital Camera Watch or something to that effect. Showing off basically the new R5 interface, and it's very interesting to me. It's very similar, as we saw in the Canon picture, to what the R has, or the EOS R. It's also kind of different to the EOS R, and it has, for example, it has a rear control dial that's very similar to what you have on a 5D, but it also has the secondary control dial, or the rear control dial, up at the top of the camera where your thumb is, that's on the EOS R. And so there's a lot of, I guess you could call it, I have open questions about sort of what's going on in Canon's mirrorless camera design camp. Looking, just to put my personal perspective on it, I'm really excited about the camera. I think I've said this in my EOS R5 video, it's the first time I've really been excited about a mirrorless camera, period, but it's kind of the first time I've been really excited about a camera in probably since the 5D Mark II. I know I jumped on the 5D Mark IV as soon as it came out because it was a substantial technical improvement over the 5D Mark III. I'm sorry, the 5D Mark III, not the 5D Mark II. I know I jumped on the Mark IV when it came out because it was a substantial technical improvement over the 5D Mark III, but I don't remember really being hotly excited about the camera, kind of thrilled for new gear in the way that I'm sort of finding myself with the R5. Certainly specs are there, but I really, there's just something about the R5 in terms of like capabilities that's sort of really scratching an itch and relighting a passion in terms of like for gear that I have not felt in a long time. I have very much gotten to the point with my camera gear that it's a tool, new gear is nice, the gear I have is good, I went around in circles on the EOS R, sort of, do I want to get one, do I not want to get one? I just couldn't bring myself to do it. It just didn't interest me really that much. But the R5, or 5R, I can never remember what the name is, R5, the R5 really has sort of lit a fire under that anticipation for camera gear that I have. And looking at the design of the camera, where controls, how it's being laid out, what they're showing, or what we're seeing at least, it's really, I'm not finding that I'm tanking on that. Like, I'm still kind of very excited about what's coming, how this is going to play out. It's kind of funny in a way because I'm excited about the R5, I'm excited about the 100 to 500. The whole rest of the EOS R system right now, I just don't really care that much about. I think part of that might just be the fact that I'm not ready to spend $7,500 or whatever it is to replace my staple EF lenses with RF equivalents. And yeah, they're nice, yeah, they're fast, yeah, they're image stabilized. I have good glass. Lack of image stabilization in lens isn't such a big concern to me because, like, I've been shooting with this 24-70 2.8 Mark II for many years now. It's not image stabilized. I deal with it. It's just not a big deal. And of course, with the R5 supposedly being in-body image stabilized, I will have should have image stabilization with these non-image stabilized lenses, even if it's not the best in the world. But anyway, what I wanted to talk about with respect to the EOS R, the R5, that whole design process is a little bit about the UI design that I'm looking at and sort of the open questions that I kind of keep running into. And you know, it's funny because I sat down and I started writing a whole pile of notes about why this, why that, why the next thing. And I realized in researching that there's a lot of stuff the EOS R does that I don't really understand because I don't have an R, I don't shoot with an R. And that makes it even harder for me to leap to talking about the R5. The other thing that I want to point out, because not having a huge basis to talk about the details kind of lends me to not want to talk about the details, but I do want to talk sort of about a bigger picture thing on it. The other thing that I wanted to sort of point out is I've read through a number of discussions, some on Canon Rumors, etc., about people talking about the camera and the UI and whatnot. And it strikes me that there's a lot of people that I have seen posting about the pictures of the R5 who have immediately adopted the position that it's different than the 5D, therefore it's bad. And I have been really trying to keep an open mind about this because, for example, on the 5D, its predecessors, most of Canon's DSLRs or higher end DSLRs, there's there's 3 buttons, or sometimes 4. On the 1Ds it's 2, I think, but there's 3 buttons for controls. We'll just limit this to the 5D. There's 3 buttons for controls on the top plate behind the shutter release above the LCD screen, and these 3 buttons control the ISO and flash exposure compensation, the drive and autofocus mode, and the metering mode, and the color temperature. And it's a real convenient, easy way to change ISO, to change and access these settings. And they're gone on the EOS R. They're not there. And they're not there on the R5. They're being handled in a different way. And, I had a real sort of first reaction to kind of go, well, that's crap. Like, here's a camera architect. You're like, going from DSLR to mirrorless doesn't change any of that stuff. If you're a serious photographer, you still need control over the ISO. You still want to have control over your flash exposure compensation. Basically everything I put or listed in that list, you still want to have control over. So not having that user interface that's been honed and refined over, almost 2 decades now. You can trace it back to film cameras to a certain extent in the early 2000s, at least 15 years, essentially. They've honed and refined an interface, and now they're changing it. And it's real easy to go, well, it's garbage. Why? Here's this refined interface that's been improved and improved and improved and built on year after year and tuned, or generation after generation, and tuned to make things accessible to photographers. And they go mirrorless, and some idiot at Canon engineer goes, well, it's mirrorless. We don't need all of those things. You could do it some other way. And I mean, that was sort of a gut reaction that I had with the EOS R and looking at, the R5. And then I realized, like, as a perfect example, I have experience with an EOS M5, which is obviously not full frame, but it's a mirrorless camera from Canon. It has a top control dial. It has, in some ways it has controls that are laid out very similarly to what the R5 has, or is shown as having. And the top quick control dial on the M5 which shouldn't be confused with the quick control dial on, say, a 5D. It actually doesn't perform the same function or anywhere near the same function. But the top quick control dial on the M5 controls all of those things that you would control on the 5D by hitting a button and then working the main command dial. But instead, you rotate through what that command dial controls. So by default, it controls the ISO, and if you hit the dial function button, it then switches to drive mode, AF mode, white balance, etc. And what I found shooting with the M5 is that's actually not a bad way to do things. The control that I'm most interested in wanting to control, so looking at like this picture here of the R5, the back of the camera, the way I'm assuming, and of course nobody has, unless you've been NDA'd and are shooting with a test camera from Canon, there isn't any public information available on what the controls are doing. But so you have a main dial behind the shutter release, and that you could assume will control the most important shooting features, so like the aperture and aperture priority, the shutter and shutter priority, etc. And you have the same kind of sub-command or quick command dial, as they would call it on a 5D, on the back of the camera. And we could assume that will control exposure compensation or the secondary things. So, for example, in manual mode, typically the front dial controls the shutter speed and the rear dial controls the aperture. So we could assume that those two dials would work similar to a 5D DSLR. And then you have the dial that's around the mode button, which on EOS R is your secondary dial, essentially. But on this camera, that dial could very easily be mimicking the function dial on the EOS M5 or M6, where by default that's your ISO. So now you have three dials, and the three dials control ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, or ISO, shutter speed, or aperture, and exposure compensation. And yeah, in a sense, not having a button to directly access the drive mode, autofocus mode, etc., is arguably slower than how it would work, or how it works on a 5D, for example. However, the flip side of that is you have much faster control over potentially the ISO. And, in having used the M5, my experience in general with shooting is fast control over the ISO is great. I don't need that kind of responsiveness in changing the drive mode or metering mode or whatever. So that's it's a different UI, and that's sort of, I think, the most important aspect of looking at this. Is just because it's different doesn't mean it's worse, and it may in fact have benefits that aren't readily obvious because of doing things another way. That said, there are definitely places where I find myself kind of curious or wondering what Canon's really doing, or what their engineers are thinking. The top left plate, for example, has a very large power switch, and that's it. And while you could argue that, yes, because it's a mirrorless camera, having a large power switch that indicates the power, it's more important to have control over the power in the camera on a mirrorless camera than it is in a super power efficient DSLR. At the same time, it seems to me like they could do something much more efficient there. Like, the 1D has adjustments, settings adjustments, buttons to adjust settings there. And even on that same argument that the power switch needs to be bigger and more obvious because it's a mirrorless camera, that's not really the case with the EOS Ms. They have all pretty small power switches. The M3 has just a button and an LED to indicate whether the camera's on or off. The M5 has a little flicky power switch that's much more reminiscent of the switch that's around the mode dial in the 5D Mark IV. And it seems like there's a wasted design, user interface thing there. I'm also, for example, not over the top about not having a dedicated mode dial. Now, sort of the kind of counterpoint to that is, if this is anything like the EOS R, there's a whole lot more modes in the camera than there is in, say, a 5D, at least the way Canon's chosen to express things. So the R has individual modes, manual, aperture priority, etc., for shooting stills and for shooting video. And if you want to sort of switch the camera from still shooting to video shooting, you hit the mode button, you hit the info button, it flips the camera over to video mode or to still mode if you're in video mode, and then you select the mode, the exposure mode that you want to use. Versus on like the EOS 5D, you have the modes and you flip a switch to put the camera into video mode, and it basically, video mode is a subset of the exposure mode, whereas on the EOS R, it's not really. It's a kind of, exposure modes are separated. But like, I can't really talk about that in any detail because I don't have any experience with that, and none of the other Canon cameras that I have work in that sort of way. It could be annoying, especially if you can't sort of hide things you don't use, like if you can't turn off the auto exposure modes so that it just has the quote basic zone or creative zone or whatever the heck Canon calls it, the aperture priority, etc. That could be a little frustrating, but that's something that's going to be a have to use the camera and see. The other thing that I can say, and again, here's the other problem with sort of talking about the R5 and what it's doing, is we don't have all the manuals, we don't have like pictures with screens on, so we could assume that, like, for example, the top LCD is going to display information similar to what the EOS R displays, but it's entirely possible that the top LCD will display information completely differently from what the EOS R displays, or slightly differently. And not having a real good idea about that makes it hard to sort of talk about, well, is that a good thing or a bad thing? So, again, instead of just rambling about, well, this could be good, this could be bad, whatever, I think I'm going to just sort of wrap it up and to say that I will definitely be talking about the R5 when I get one. As things stand, looking at the camera right now, I'm definitely on board for getting one. It does look like it's kind of ticking all the check boxes that I'm interested in when it comes to a mirrorless camera, especially from Canon, especially with my intended uses and so on. And my sort of interest in talking about user interface design and how it impacts in cameras. It's going to be very fun to sit an R5 and a 5D down right next to each other and look at how they work, and if the overall user interface design is sort of moving forward, or if Canon is kind of screwing up, you could say, or if there's serious problems to look at. But that obviously is going to require a 5R for me to talk about and deal with, and so that'll be a future video, obviously, once they are released. So with that said, I'm going to cut this short here. I'm only a little bit longer than I had intended to go, so it's a good time as any to cut it short. If you made it this far in this video, thank you so much for watching. If you'd like more content like this, please subscribe to the channel. I would love to hear from you if you have some thoughts on the camera, the EOS R or Adobe's change, the contents of the video, whatever the topics of the video. Feel free to drop a comment. Also, if you found this slightly rambly kind of video vlog interesting, please smash the like button. As I said, if you'd like to see more content about Canon cameras, sort of technical stuff, etc., please subscribe to the channel. Also, if you're interested in written version of technical content, same kind of thing, cameras, travel, gear reviews, etc., please check out my website at pointsandfocus.com. There's a link, as always, in the description and, in fact, in the channel header. So, again, thank you for watching, and see you next time.